not because it was sinful in itself, but because it led to other abuses, which we're starting to see. But it also led to a decline in people's reverence for the Eucharist or belief in the real presence. There was notice that they restricted it to the priests. Unfortunately.
And this is the common question, Father Chad. If we take the communion by hands, is it a desecration, Father?
Yeah. So, okay. So there is a distinction in theology has always been applied to this particular thing, because this question because in the early church, the lay people actually did receive communion in the hand for a very short period of time. And so historically, the theologians had addressed this: was it sacrilegious? And despite what some of the things that were actually said consequently to that, the fact is that there's a distinction between what is not sinful and then what's perfect. So historically, they said, well, there wasn't anything sinful in itself. Now, the church has said, restricted it and said, no, only the priest can handle it because it's a matter of suitability, because his hands are consecrated. And so what's consecrated, that is his hands, is handling what's consecrated. It is the Eucharist. So they said that suitability meant that was where the perfection lied. So even though it wasn't sinful, the more perfect thing is for only the priest to handle it. At a certain point, some theologians, but it wasn't by any stretch of the imagination necessarily all the theologians, said that it was sinful to handle the Eucharist. It was only sinful because of the fact that it became sacrilegious because the church had restricted it, not because it was sinful in itself, but because it led to other abuses, which we're starting to see. But it also led to a decline in people's reverence for the Eucharist or belief in the real presence. There was notice that they restricted it to the priests. And then as a result, the priests, because it was a more perfect way of handling it, it maintained people's belief in the real presence. So then the church restricted it. So that meant if a layman handled the Eucharist, then it was considered sacrilegious because of the disobedience, not so much because of the fact that it was sinful in itself. So that's the way the church had always talked about it. I know some modern theologians are trying to argue that it's sinful in itself, but that just hasn't been the tradition of the church. I'm not in favor of it, that the lay people handling the Eucharist, only because of the fact that, as I mentioned, it leads to these other issues, but also that it's more reverent. I would argue that they receive it on the tongue and only the priests handle it.
And Father, Chad, what advice can you say to those Catholics who are watching in this interview that still taking the communion by hand because they are afraid to be rejected by the clergy or the lay minister?
Yeah, that's a big problem. Actually, even here in the United States, we see this type of thing going on. If people come up and want to receive it on the tongue, or even kneeling, because the Vatican itself itself has said, no, they can receive it kneeling and on the tongue. That's their right to do that. That doesn't necessarily always mean that the priests are going to respect that right that the lay people have in receiving Holy Communion in that fashion. And so, basically what I tell them to do is that they should still try and do so. If the priest, so I just tell them you should still try and receive it on the tongue. If you can receive it kneeling and the priest isn't going to create too much of a fuss about it, then I would go ahead and receive it kneeling and on the tongue. But if not, if he's going to really create a problem for you kneeling, then I would just say, well, then just receive, so that you can observe modesty and you're not drawing undue attention to yourself. Just receive it, but at least receive it on the tongue, because that's at least your right to do so as a Catholic. So as I mentioned, this was even during COVID. There was some discussion about it because there was during COVID, there was a complaint that was sent by a question that was actually sent to Rome about this, saying, well, can't the bishops force everybody to receive it in the hand because it's actually, you have less likely of ability to transmit COVID. Well, first of all, the CDC here in the United States came out and said, no, it doesn't really matter whether they receive it on the tongue or on the hand. You're still, the possibility of transmitting it didn't make any difference either way. So that wasn't a legitimate argument. But the Vatican came back and said, no, they still have a right to receive it kneeling and on the tongue. So that was the Vatican itself said that.
Yeah, because here in our country, when I observed during communion, most of the communicants receive it by hands. I mean,
That's correct. Yeah.
yeah.
And I think it's just a lot of it has to do with the way people have been trained, etc. But I think at least in the United States, I know that in certain parts, and I think that this is also true actually in other places worldwide, that if the clergy educate people on how this is, it's more reverent, it's more respectful of the Eucharist if you receive it kneeling and on the tongue, and it observes that suitability of the priest only being the ones that handle it. And we find that when you educate people, what happens is 95% of them will start receiving it kneeling and on the tongue, and only just to continue to receive it in the hand. So I think that if it's, it's one of those things that if the lay people are actually informed about it, there's usually a bit of a shift. But I think a lot of it, the reason most of them are receiving it now is because they were trained that way or formed that way.
And Father Chad, how should Catholics respond when they witness or hear about the desecration of the Eucharist?
I think it depends somewhat on the circumstances. If it's something in which the priest is unaware of it and he needs to, if they were able to inform him and that he would actually correct and address the issue, then they should do so. If it's something which, but the normal first response would be to try and do a short act or a small act of reparation to our Lord for it because he's been offended by it. So that should be their first, to make reparation for it. That's the primary thing. And then if they're in a position to either inform the priest or to sometimes even correct the priest, because sometimes the priests are not doing what they're supposed to do. Some priests are open to correction and some aren't. So if they're open to the correction, then they should try and say something to the priest about it. But if he's not, then what they need to do is make those acts of reparation and just start praying so that Our Lady gives the priest the grace to see that he needs to start handling it or doing it in a different way so that there's no desecration.
What action can families take at home to foster deeper reverence for the Eucharist?
Well, I think there's two things that they can do. One is study the Church's teaching on it and actually ask Christ, for the graces to have a deep respect and to make their confessions more worthily, so they can actually learn how to receive the Eucharist in a more worthy or in a more devout fashion. And so basically they can learn to make sure they're doing prayers of preparation, make sure that they're, which comes in making the acts of contrition before they receive it, and also asking our Lord to give them the grace to do it, and try and be, when they receive it, to be as humble and as devout as possible and as loving to our Lord when they receive it as possible. So they can kind of start beginning that formation at home, especially. The other part of it is sometimes people can't get to communion every single day, and so getting into the practice of making spiritual communions every day. So you can actually just go online and just find the prayers that, how to make a spiritual communion. And it's usually just a prayer that just says, Jesus,
I see.
Even though I can't receive you now physically, I ask you to come to me spiritually, is the general gist of the prayer. And so you can actually say that prayer each day. And then even though you're not receiving the Eucharist, a lot of times Christ will give you additional graces as if you had. And so this has been a long-standing traditional practice that people can actually do. So you can go online and actually just find those prayers. And so in the context of the family, if they can't get to Mass every day, if the parents start training the children, encouraging them, even as a family, to make that spiritual communion, once a day at least, that would be one of the principal ways in which they can really develop that devotion to the Eucharist.
So mga ka-faith, a quick promotion lang ng bagong libronet ni Brother Bo Sanchez. Multiple income streams, How I Created 7 Money Machine, and How You Can Too by Brother Bo Sanchez. At kung di nyo po kilala si Brother Bo Sanchez, sino bang hindi nakakilala sa kanya na isang sikat na Catholic preacher, influencer at motivational speaker, at kilala rin si Brother Bo Sanchez na isang magaling na financial teacher, kaya sinulat niya itong multiple income streams. Good news mga faith na itong librong ito ni Brother Bo Sanchez ay libre lang po ito. This is for free, pinamimigay niya to ng libre sa mga interested po na magkaroon ng libreng copy ng librong ito ni Brother Bo Sanchez. Alam nyo, nung binabasa ko to, ang dami ko natutunan dito ng mga teachings ni Brother Bo. Siya yung naging way at naging dahilan para magawa kong full-time itong ginagawa ko bilang isang online content creator. Dahil doon nakapag-build ako ng 4 na sources of income, kaya ako nagagawa itong ginagawa ko ngayon. At yung mga teachings na yun ay nandito sa libreng libro na to ni Brother Bo Sanchez. Para magkaroon kayo ng libreng copy na to. Ilalagay ko yung link sa taas or sa baba ng video na to. Kailangan nyo lang ay sagutin yung shipping fee. Pwedeng through credit card or kung GCash kayo magbabayad, piliin nyo lang yung DragonPay. Makikita nyo option dyan. Thank you and God bless.